Thank you, Val. That was a lot of territory to cover. I wish we would have had about 3 hours to really do a comprehensive training. Because I think that the work that's happening at Seattle, King County, is really compelling. I think what we've really done is try to create a coordinated response that deals with the issue in a holistic way, and we haven't really seen that happen in other places. And I'm just thrilled to be a part of this, because I've been working on this issue. I've been working on the issue of commercial sexual exploitation for a long time. I co-founded OPS with Noel Gomez about 8 years ago, but I've been working on the issue of prostitution and commercial sexual exploitation for almost 30 years. And I got started doing this work not even knowing that I was going to be working on issues of prostitution. I was interested in seeing what I could do to engage men to stop domestic violence. And I was interested in seeing what I could do to stop men from committing domestic violence because I grew up in a domestic violence household. And I recognized from a pretty young age that although my father's violence became a problem for my mom and my siblings and myself, that it really was his problem. That it was his lack of social emotional learning, his inability to deal with frustrations, anxieties, disappointments, and his feelings of entitlement to take it out on the people around him, the people who he had power over, the people who loved him. And as I got older still, I started to recognize that this wasn't just going on in my house. In fact, it was happening in lots of houses. And where it was happening, it was primarily men that were doing this violence. As I got older, things happened like my sister came to me and told me she'd been sexually assaulted. Other female and male friends of mine started talking to me about the abuse they experienced, sexual abuse they experienced as kids. Again, disproportionately and primarily at the hands of men. Yeah, most men didn't do most of those types of violence, but when they were done, they were being done by men. And again, I located this as a problem with the hearts of men. And so in my 20s, I got really interested in what can I do to help engage boys and young men to prevent these behaviors. And so I got involved with a group in Portland, Oregon called the Portland Women's Crisis Line, and a mentor of mine by the name of Tess Weishart. And she, with her, we created this training program, and we worked with men to train them to go in partnership into the public schools and do prevention work on domestic violence and sexual assault and sexual harassment. And if I could travel back in time and go to my younger self and say, what about prostitution? I would have looked at myself and said, what are you talking about? What does that have to do with anything? That's a victimless crime. That's a consensual. I'm a good progressive guy. I would never tell anybody what to do or what not to do with their body. And that's about all I thought about it. But because of my work on domestic violence and sexual assault, and because there was a remarkable group of women that were working in Portland at the time that had formed this organization called the Council for Prostitution Alternatives, I got to meet a bunch of women who had been in their life. And as I got to meet them and got to hear their stories, it turned my head 180 degrees around on prostitution. And I don't need to go into why that is, right? I'm sure you all know what I learned from those women, because it's what you know, which is what a lot of people in the culture still, in the rest of the country, still don't know. Right? That although I met them when they were adults, they entered as teenagers. They had experienced physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect in the home, ran away from home, spent a good deal of time away from home, or were taken out of home to get away from that abuse where they were vulnerable to emotional manipulation by pimps who used physical and sexual abuse to gain power and maintain control over them in systems that I was starting to realize were remarkably similar to domestic violence. While they were in their life, they were physically tortured, they were sexually assaulted, they were kidnapped, they were mutilated, they were murdered at rates far off the charts from any other group. They were committed suicide. If they managed to get out of the life, they struggled with PTSD. They couldn't get jobs because their behavior had been criminalized, right? And I really started to look at this and say, how could this be that I hadn't seen this before? In fact, prostitution is a practice of gender-based violence that's rooted in inequality. Right? And as I started to understand that, I started to try and think, what was it that I could do to help end commercial sexual exploitation? And so the director of Council for Prostitution Alternatives at the time, a woman by the name of Susan Hunter, also a mentor of mine, suggested that I should think about working with men, and I was really disappointed about that. Right? I was hoping that somehow, I could do some great work and help, people get their lives back on track. And she said, no. She said, nobody's working with the buyers. That really needs to be a focus. And so I started one of the first sex buyers intervention programs in the country in Portland in 1995. It was called the Sexual Exploitation Education Program, or SEEP, one of the most unfortunate acronyms ever. Great name. And presently, I run a 10-week sex buyer intervention program based on what I've learned about sex buyers, sex buying, and what I've learned from survivors. Because everything I know about the harms of prostitution, I've learned from listening to survivors. Because they are the experts on that, and they're the ones that we need to be accountable to. When we talk about accountability, I always think about that as accountability to the survivors. That's who I answer to, because that's who's harmed by this practice. And so I'm going to share with you now a bit about what I've learned about sex buyers intervention programs or John schools. How many of you have John schools in your communities? Okay. How many of you are happy with the John schools you have in your communities? Many communities across the country are doing one-day diversion programs for buyers of commercial sex that don't work. They don't work on a number of different levels that I'm happy to talk about. And I think that the program that we've developed is 10 weeks long, and I think that it could be way longer, and I think it could be way more robust. Before I launch into that, diving down deep into the John schools, though, and the sex buyers intervention programs, I just want to say that do not think that you can just do this in your communities. How many arrests of buyers do we have? We put about 200 men through our class every year. How many men were looking for sex in a 24-hour period in King County just on Backpage.com? Over 6,000. Right? And so we can't think that this is doing enough. We need to do the prevention work. We need to do outreach. We need to do men's engagement work. We need to, of course, have all of this coordinated with services for youth and adults that are survivor-led exit services. So really thinking about this, about the sex buyer intervention in the context of that bigger work is very important, because although, like Val said, it is an individual behavioral problem, it's also a social practice. And so we need to work throughout the layers of social ecology in order to deal with the issue. So one of the things people always ask me when they hear what I do is, why do men buy sex? And there's a lot of different answers to that, but I'm going to give you two quotes from sex buyers that I think capture a couple aspects of it. Here's one participant who a couple weeks into the class came to this realization and said, I buy sex because the only thing I'm more afraid of than intimacy is rejection. Does that make sense? This other man said the same thing in a different way. I buy sex because I love sex, but I hate women. How is that saying the same thing? Well, after I picked my jaw up off the desk when this guy said this to me during his interview, I said, what do you mean? What do you mean you buy sex because you love sex but you hate women? And he said, well, I was in a relationship for 15 years and she took everything I had. I'm never going to trust one of them again. I'm just going to pay for sex. I buy sex because the only thing I'm more afraid of than intimacy is rejection. I buy sex because I've embodied toxic masculinity and I'm ill-equipped to deal with being a human being in the world. And I punish other people around me for it, and I punish women for it especially. Because I can. And because I can prove my manhood to myself by doing just that. And talk to my buddies about it on the review boards. So, a number of years ago, some serendipitous stuff happened in around 2010, I got connected with Val Ritchie, and we started to figure out what we were going to do to create a program in Seattle to be able to do a project around demand. And at the same time, my longtime friend Melissa Farley contacted me about this study that she was doing in Boston, looking at men who bought sex and comparing them to men who didn't buy sex. And these things happened around the same time that I got the opportunity to create a new model of sex buyer intervention at the same time that we were starting to get, for once, some pretty good data about what was unique about men who bought sex and compared it to men who didn't buy sex. And so I'm just going to go through some of the findings and recommendations. And Dr. Farley has done she's a hero of mine, and has done some amazing work both on the survivor side of things, but especially on the buyer. She identified way before anybody else was thinking about it how important it was to do research with this population. So if anybody can fund her to do more research, you should do that, because she is amazing, right? And has done none of this would be happening without the work of people like Melissa Farley. So anyway, what some of the findings that we came up with through this study was, and as of other studies, sex buyers expressed ambivalence, guilt, and negative thinking about buying sex. They felt just as many negative feelings after buying sex as they did before. Right? It's not something that was serving them either, and we're going to explore that a bit more. Another thing we saw was that many sex buyers sought sex that lacked emotional connection. They had little objection if the woman they purchased pretend to like them or actively dislike performing the act of prostitution. Again, I buy sex because the only thing I'm more afraid of than intimacy is rejection, and I buy sex because I love sex but I hate women. Sex buyers repeatedly commented that they liked the power relationship in prostitution, and they liked the freedom from any relationship obligation. They liked to not have to treat the other person as a human being, and they liked her inability to say no. Both sex buyers and non-sex buyers evidenced extensive knowledge of the physical and psychological harms of prostitution. 2/3 of both the sex buyers and the non-sex buyers observed that a majority of women are lured, tricked, or trafficked into prostitution. So they know. They know about the harm. As one of the men in my class said when I was doing a presentation on harm during week number 2 a couple of months back, I asked him, so were you familiar with these issues, all of these issues of harm to people in prostitution? And he was remarkably candid, and he said, well, if I'm going to be honest, Peter, I knew, but I just wasn't thinking about it at the time. Many of the men had an awareness of the economic coercion and lack of alternatives in women's entry into prostitution. Almost all of the sex buyers and non-sex buyers shared the opinion that minor children are almost always available for prostitution in bars, massage parlors, escort, and other prostitution in Boston. So they knew. They knew. The knowledge that the women have been exploited, coerced, pimped, or trafficked failed to deter sex buyers from buying sex. Many of the sex buyers had used women who were controlled by pimps at the time they used her for sex. And they knew this. They seemed to justify their involvement in the sex industry by stating their belief that women in prostitution are essentially different from non-prostituting people. For those of you who were in the Me Too Talk panel yesterday, we talked a little bit about this good girl, bad girl dichotomy, and about the way people in prostitution and the way women generally are blamed for the harm that they experience in the world at the hands of men. Just one more slide of some of these summaries. Both sex buyers and non-sex buyers subscribe to the theory that prostitution reduces the likelihood of rape, which is it's false. But this has been this catharsis theory that's been operational for generations, right? Where they say, unless you have this group that is going to be targeted, then other people are going to be targeted. And what we know is that that's false. Some of the recent analysis that's been done of this same data set that Neil Maloney's helped out with has shown us that, in fact, sex buyers are more likely to commit sexual assault on people both in prostitution and not in prostitution. Okay. Although half of the studies sampled did not buy sex, many of them were tolerant of prostitution for men who did. This is why we really need to engage the bystander. This is why we really need to support men to find the courage to stand up to other men on this. And I talked about a little bit about this yesterday, but I think it's really important that we be able to find men who are not buying sex, but be able to get them to take a position on sex buying as a practice of inequality. So these findings suggest that efforts to deter buyers should expand their focus from men who buy sex to the general public's attitudes that support prostitution. So I put all this out there because when you look at that information and then compare it to what a traditional John School is, a traditional John School is a one-day class that's a diversion program in a large group. It's a lecture format, it claims effectiveness. It's a shotgun approach, meaning they just put a lot of information out there. And what kind of information gets put out there in John Schools? Anybody know, generally? Okay, and do you think they know about the health consequences? Yep. And go ahead. Legal issues? Yep, do you think they know about the legal issues? Okay. Do you think, most of the better ones talk a lot about the harm. Do you think they know about the harm? Okay. The sex addiction? Right, and don't even get me started because we need another 3 hours to talk about sex addiction. I remember back when I was doing the first John School in Portland, I got a call from one of the wives of the men who was sent to the class, and she's like, but he tells me he has an addiction. And I remember saying to her, I'm sure he does. I'm sure that he says that. But for him, it was a lot about not being accountable for what he'd done, right? And I think that even my sex addiction people that I work with, talk about maybe 1 in 6 having a compulsive or addictive pattern of behaviors. And we could take that apart and talk a lot about why it is people in prostitution that are targeted by people who have sex addiction. But I won't go there now. But I bring this all up to say that the traditional John School doesn't make sense. It does not make sense as an intervention in a number of ways. First of all, it's a diversion, right? So there's no, for some places, it's a pre-arrest diversion. For some places, if they're able to swipe their card and do, in some places, as little as a 15-minute video, they're done. Even in the places that have a 6-hour or 8-hour class, they sit in a classroom of up to 70 other men, right, and have a series of people come and lecture at them. How effective do you think that's going to be in engaging them? It's just not indicated. It's not indicated by what we know about buyers. So what's going to work with buyers? Stopping sexual exploitation, a program for men, might work with some buyers. I know it has worked with some. I never want to get too to overstate the impact of programs, especially court-mandated programs. If you're arrested for drunk driving and you go to a class about drunk driving, are you going to stop drunk driving? Maybe. Is the drunk driving class going to be a failure if you don't? Are we going to recognize that there's some choice here, right? There's some other factors that we need to consider. But we also can't consider sex buyers intervention as a magic bullet. Like it's not enough. It may help some folks, but it's not enough. And I'll talk about that a bit more. So when we designed SSE, or Stopping Sexual Exploitation Program for Men, we wanted to make it post-conviction, right? So they already have been through and have all of the other consequences. They have the conviction, they have the fine, they have everything else. They're not getting anything taken away. They have to come through the class. And the class is in multiple sessions, right? So they come through multiple sessions over time. And that's really important because they go back into their lives, think about the stuff, talk about it, and then come back and have to deal with it again the next week. Right? It's not like this one compartmentalized thing that they can just put behind them. And the importance of multiple sessions was illustrated to me. I really have 5 minutes only left? Okay. The importance of multiple sessions was illustrated to me last year in this class. The first day, we were dealing with gender. I have 10? Yes. So the first day, I was talking about gender socialization for men. And I had one guy in the class, and he was like a parody of himself. He was like a construction guy, man spreading across the seats with his arm like this, chuckling as I'm going through talking about toxic masculinity. And at one point I look at him and I said, you know, what's so funny? Like, you're not saying anything. What do you think about all this stuff? And he's like, well, you know, I think that I'm a man and I like pussy. And men have been chasing pussy since the dawn of time. So I'm going to continue to do that. So I said, this is going to be a really difficult and long class. And he was similarly checked out. You know, I would always confront him and ask him lots of questions about why he needed to be such a jerk and everything. But over time, like we talked the next week about harm to people in prostitution. The next week we talked about sexual assault and the sexual violence continuum. And he was similarly dismissive. And then he came back in the week number 4. And at the start of every class, I say to the men, you know, anybody thought about anything that we talked about last week? And this guy, when he came into the class that night, was kind of shaken up. He was sitting in a much different way. And when I said, does anybody have anything they want to share? He said, yeah, I got something I want to share. He said, I went home to my girlfriend and I told her how you guys were full of shit, talking about sexual assault. He said, my girlfriend got really mad at me, and she pointed at me and she said, you listen to those guys because they're telling you the truth. And I know they're telling you the truth because I've been sexually assaulted 2 times in my life, and I've never been able to tell you because you are not a safe person to tell. And then he said, what does it mean that this person that I love more than anybody in the world that I've been with for 7 years doesn't trust me enough to talk about it? It means you're a jerk. He was pretty quiet for the rest of that class, and for the remaining classes, he wasn't particularly engaged. I don't know if he stopped buying sex, but he was forced to confront the reality of men's violence, right? So that would have never happened in a one-day class. Never happened in a one-day class. Another important thing to do is individual and small group activities. Make it as interactive as possible for them. Again, we got to acknowledge the limitations, have clear goals, and be process-based. We need to, in the class, model a mode of being for these men that's very different from the toxic masculinity. We need to be the change that we want them to make. And that's why it's really important to have facilitators who are capable of delivering this process-based practice that we call Stopping Sexual Exploitation, the program for men. So it serves several groups in King County. We get sex buyers who have been referred by the criminal justice system. I get sex buyers who choose to attend the program voluntarily. About 20% come voluntarily, allegedly voluntarily. In reality, their wives send them when they catch them, or they come through therapists' referrals. There are very few have come from directly from the contact on the internet, but we get some, a few. Any man that comes up to me after a training or a presentation in the community that says, I want to come help, how can I come help? I say, go through the class as a participant. Because the last thing you're going to be able to do is to help unless you have done the work on yourself that you need to do. Okay, and this is one of those men who was a self-referred participant. He said, I signed up for this class because I want to understand more about what causes some men, not him, to want to buy sex or perpetuate violence against women and children in this manner. What I found is that we as men are all hurting inside to some degree or another. Unless we understand and face our pain, we're destined to pass it on to others, whether it's in buying sex or behaving badly in our own personal relationships. So what we ask of our partners who work with us is that law enforcement continue to do the online stings. And if you have a sex buyer intervention program in your community, you need those things to continue happening because you need a steady flow of men coming through the class. You need to be sure that the city attorneys and prosecutors are on board and the judges are on board in order to get the men to come through. We have 3 process-based goals of the Stopping Sexual Exploitation program. The first is we really need to reframe prostitution away from it, understanding it as a victimless crime, and start understanding it as a practice of violence against women or gender-based violence. The second process-based goal is we need to deconstruct toxic masculinity for the men. To take apart how sex has worked in their lives, what it's meant to them, and how that's related to their own identification as men, or as I call it, unpacking horniness. Right? When the men come and I say, why did you buy sex? I buy sex because I'm horny. It's like, okay, we're going to need to unpack that. One of the men recently did an interview with someone, and at the end of the class, the final class, the interviewer asked him, so why do you buy sex? And he said, well, first night I said that I buy sex because I was horny. Now I know I bought sex because I was mad at my wife. Yeah, right? And so there's a way that this is a practice of coercive control in a relationship, and you can't separate this from intimate partner violence. That we've seen already that more than 50% of these guys are intimate partners. Do you think they're telling them about this? No. Do you think when they have a fight with them, an argument with them, that because they can't even work through stuff, that they punish them by going out and secretly having sex with another person that they pay for? Yes, that's precisely what they're doing. So they apply for the program. We do a individual phone session with them and an orientation, and then 8 weeks of weekly classes. Those first 2 sessions, we engage them in a process of motivational interviewing. Anybody familiar with motivational interviewing? Yep, okay. So it's designed to resolve ambivalence, right? And what we know is that sex buyers have a lot of ambivalence about this practice. Around 70% agree with the statement that they want to stop buying sex. So the motivational interviewing is a method that works on engaging them. The first session is by phone, and I'm ready for them, when I have that conversation on the phone, to engage them by saying this. When I'm having this conversation with men, they usually have been through a real challenging time. Has that been true for you? Many have lost their jobs, many have lost their partners. And what that does is it gets them to focus on themselves. Because their initial tendency is going to be to blame people in prostitution, right? And say, somebody somewhere likes this, so this is okay for me. Or just should be legalized and regulated. It's like, no, we're not. That's not where we start off. We start off with, has this been challenging for you? When they say yes, then I'm able to say, well, what about before the arrest? Were there challenges for you? Were there negative aspects of your sex buying? The second week, we meet them in person, and we further that conversation. They sign a group agreement with us. We've got 1 minute left. These are the 8 modules that we do with them. I'd love to walk you through the arc of the class and the importance of it. You'll notice that after week 5, we don't even do a lot of talking about gender-based violence. It's much more oriented towards healthy relationships and how they could actively be a part of social change. In the Will to Change, week number 8, we not only talk about the individual change, but we talk about engaging them in helping to end commercial sexual exploitation and gender-based violence. I have a group of alumni, men that agreed to participate in groups after the class, that have done things like help us develop the content for the videos, help us develop our outreach plans for other men who buy sex. So does it work? 90% say they're thinking about prostitution has changed. It used to be 98%, and then Val did his review boards thing, and all those guys didn't do my class, and it just dropped the success rate. And anybody who's interested in that, I'm doing a presentation on male bonding and the review boards tomorrow, because that's fascinating. Their post-assessment results, right? Before the program, they said women in prostitution could not be raped, men had a right to buy sex, women were not harmed. If I give them money, she should do whatever I want. She freely chooses prostitution, and she likes what she's doing. After the class, today, I think it's really different. Participants were asked additional questions. 79% agreed, I will talk to other men about the negative impacts of my sex buying. I got the initial batch of, can I take 1 more minute? Okay. I got the initial batch of the surveys back, and somebody had answered it in pencil, and that question he had circled neutral and then erased it, and then circled slightly agree. And I looked to my assistant, Zuzka, and I said, Zuzka, we are successful. This is working, right? Because that measuring if they're going to talk to other men about this is significant. 87% agreed that prostitution had a negative impact on their life. 88% that it had a negative impact on others in their life, and 84% that prostitution buying had a negative impact on prostituted people. So in summary, it suggested that we were meeting most of those process goals in terms of their decision to not buy sex again, reframing prostitution from a victimless crime to a system of gender-based violence, eliminating toxic masculinity, encouraging healthy masculinities. Just 3 quick quotes from men that have been through the class. Class helped me take a good long look at myself and my relationships. I want to use this to make my relationship with my wife a mutual relationship rather than a controlling one where I'm trying to control her. We've had 3 men that have self-referred to domestic violence programs after being through the class because they recognize patterns of coercive control in their relationships. This guy, I'm going to raise my son differently. I don't want him to be so angry and depressed all the time like me. And then this guy, I really like this class. But 10 weeks is not enough. We've been in this problem for 10 years, so 10 weeks is not enough. We need more. Particularly annoying because this guy in the beginning was complaining about how long the class was. And I want to end with 2 final slides. The first is from Mary Watkins that I think really summarizes the way I think about the work I do in engaging men. Once departing from false universals, unconscious identification with dominant ideologies, then fixed schemas of development, an interior sense of self that finds alternative orientations become possible. But like drunk driving, it's only going to work if you choose to do it. I had this guy say, or not. I feel great about buying sex. What happens to prostitutes is not my fault. It's not my problem. The only thing stopping from me is that I don't want to get arrested again. And on that note, I'll wrap it up. Thank you.